David Ruffin, before his death, was the man whose voice sat at the center of the Temptations' classic era. He was one of Motown's most recognizable leads and a name tied to songs that still fill rooms. He was all of these and more until tragedy struck. On June 1st, 1991, at age 50, David Ruffin died in Philadelphia. The medical examiner in charge of his case ruled the death an accident caused by an adverse reaction to cocaine. According to reports, David had reached the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania in a borrowed limousine, and the man who drove him there left after dropping him at the emergency entrance. It didn't even take long before the questions began, and they have never fully stopped. Now, let's check this. The basic facts are not in dispute. Ruffin collapsed after using crack cocaine at a West Philadelphia address. He was transported to the hospital by a friend. Medical staff worked to revive him, but could not. The coroner labeled the cause adverse reaction to cocaine and did not change that finding later. Police interviewed the driver and other people tied to the location. No homicide charges followed. Those lines form the official record. Everything else, timing, money, motives, they all sit around that core and make the story feel unresolved, even when the file itself did not move. To understand why this case still draws attention, you have to put him back into context. In the mid to late 1960s, Ruffin's tenor carried the lead on My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, I Know I'm Losing You, and I Wish It Would Rain. And then by 1989, the Temptations were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. This was one of those times David Ruffin felt so alive. Whatever turmoil marked his career, the public record placed him in a small circle of artists whose impact had already been recognized while they were still performing. By 1989, Ruffin was living in Philadelphia. He spent time with a small group of friends and associates, including a local limousine operator, Linster Butch Merle. People who saw him often also saw the split that defined his later years. He could still command a stage, and he could also slide back into habits that damaged his health and his chances. The same city that gave him space to work also placed him within reach of people in places where drugs were easy to find. In the months before he died, David still had work. He had performed reunion dates alongside Eddie Kendricks and Dennis Edwards and completed a run in England. Those shows suggested the possibility of a steadier third act. The bookings and the audiences were there. He did not leave the stage to a cold silence. He left it with a demand for more. That contrast, an artist with present tense momentum dying in a way that confirmed the worst fears around him, made the end harder for people to accept as simply accidental. The night itself is easier to describe than it is to explain. On May 31st, 1991, Ruffin arrived at Merle's limousine service and left in a borrowed car with a friend identified later by police as Donald Brown. Sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., they went to a row house in West Philadelphia. The driver's account and police statements placed crack cocaine at that address. After midnight, Ruffin became unresponsive. According to reports, at approximately 2:55 a.m., the limousine pulled up to the hospital entrance. The attention of the hospital was called, and a few staff members carried him inside. He was pronounced dead around 3:55 a.m. The coroner called it an accidental overdose. Those times and labels make up the mechanical outline of the last hours. What happened around him is the part people still argue over. Police found only a small amount of cash on him when he arrived at the hospital, but upon the arrival of friends and family, they told reporters he had far more proceeds from recent shows, possibly carried in a money belt. A briefcase turned up later with papers inside, but not with the cash some people believed he had the night he died. There was no bank record to settle the number. The hospital could only list what arrived with the patient. Those gaps created a second story that never ended. If the death was accidental, then what happened to the money? The report within days of his death set the frame that the public still uses. Wire stories and local papers ran headlines that emphasized location and cause. Collapsed at a crack house appeared in national print. The words were blunt, and they shaped how people remembered the hour more than the decade that came before it. The same stories also noted that police wanted to speak to the driver who left, then later confirmed they had questioned him and that he was not charged. The message was consistent. The cause was drugs. The actions around him were troubling. The case was not a homicide. Now, the driver's name did not start as a rumor. It showed up in straightforward reporting that quoted police and people close to Ruffin. Merle told a reporter he loaned a limousine to Ruffin that night and said Ruffin left with a man named Donald Brown. Police identified the same name when explaining how they pieced together the timeline. They interviewed Brown more than once and did not bring a case. Every few years, the name appears again in anniversary stories and in summaries of the night, but not for once has it been linked to a charge in this death. People closest to him gave accounts that were not sensational. They said plainly what they had seen for years. He struggled with cocaine. He could rally, then lose ground. He had friends and family who wanted him to accept more help, and he did not always agree. Those statements read as tired rather than theatrical, which is usually how reality looks when people have already spent years trying to stop a pattern. They also line up with the medical examiner's findings. The part of the story that keeps it alive is the missing money. A great number of people turned a closed coroner's report into a mystery. Some accounts put the figure at $30,000 to $40,000 tied to recent performances in England. The hospital's tally listed $53 for him when he arrived. Police talked to the people who last saw him conscious and followed up on the claims of a money belt. They did not recover the larger sum and did not find evidence to support a homicide charge. The more time passed without finding anything, the more the number did the work of the mystery on its own. If you sift through the coverage that came out in the first 2 weeks, a pattern appears. The medical ruling is steady. The presence of a crack is steady. The driver's name appears, and the notices that he was questioned are steady. The only variable that grows is the money figure and the speculation attached to it. That is what happens when there is a valuable variable that cannot be proved and cannot be disproved. People begin to make meaning around the space where a fact does not exist. The case did not move because the law moved only on what was on paper. Years later, retrospective reporting in Philadelphia stepped back from the headlines and described the same end from a city vantage point. It stressed how quickly the national press settled on its angle and how straightforward the documents actually were. It did not try to erase the questions about the money. It put them in the right place in the story. A separate pain layered on top of a cause of death that was not in doubt. The articles read like an attempt to put a public figure back into a human frame. They did not change any official conclusion. The legal system also had a second chapter, but it was not about a criminal case. In 1998, a television miniseries dramatized the Temptations' history and included portrayals of Ruffin's decline and death. Members of his family and his estate sued, arguing that the portrayals were false and harmful. A federal district court dismissed the claims. The Court of Appeals affirmed. The rulings did not say the miniseries was correct. They said the claims did not meet the legal standards needed to prevail. The broadcast stayed in circulation, and that kept a televised version of events in the public mind, even when it did not align with all the documents. It is also true that the industry around him marked his passing with respect that did not depend on a lawsuit or a headline. Detroit hosted the funeral, musicians gathered, and peers spoke about what he meant to the sound that helped define their generation. The late Michael Jackson even quietly paid more than $7,000 toward the funeral bill. That detail appears again and again in coverage from the time. It is not a dramatic twist. It is simply a record of how artists sometimes take care of each other when a family is trying to manage grief and bills at the same time. When you put all of this together, the outline becomes clear. There was no late confession, no deathbed note, no lab test that overturned what the coroner wrote. There was a man with a long public battle with drugs, a night that followed a familiar path to a house where cocaine was used, a friend who drove him to a hospital and left, and a sum of cash that was never verified on paper and never recovered. The police talked to the people who were there. They did not build a homicide case because the cause of death did not support one. The medical ruling stayed where it began. The reason this can feel unsatisfying is not complicated. Accidents make poor mysteries. There is no antagonist who can explain anything. There is only a chain of decisions that leads to the point where the body fails. In this case, an extra harm sits nearby, the strong likelihood that someone took money when he could no longer defend himself. That is not the same as murder. It is another kind of wrong that fits into the hours after an overdose. It makes the story feel dirty without changing the medical line at the top of the file. People who knew him did not need the papers to tell them what he had fought. They had watched it. They had argued with him. They had tried to root him away from the blocks and the apartments where he could get high. The Philadelphia pieces that came later gathered those voices and put them in one place so the record would not be reduced to a single sentence. They also show how little any of that changes the ending once a person goes back into the room and smokes again. The heart does not keep history. It responds to the chemistry in front of it. The long memory of the public, especially around Motown, does something else. It reaches for a cleaner story. It prefers a twist that clears the person of responsibility or reveals a hidden enemy. The documents do not give that out. The threads that do exist, names, times, small decisions, are the same ones you see in many accidental deaths. The numbers attached to the missing cash lift the thread into a headline, but do not change the mechanism. That is why, decades later, the mystery remains a matter of argument rather than a matter of law. There is a separate and legitimate frustration inside that word accident. It can sound like a shrug. It is not. In medical language here, it means a lethal response to cocaine. In the city's files, it means the type of death does not point to homicide or suicide. It does not put a value judgment on the behavior around him, driving away from a hospital door, failing to stay, failing to hand over information that would have helped staff immediately reach the family. Those acts are still what they are. The label at the top of the form does not excuse them. It just names the mechanism that stopped the breathing. If you search for a turning point that might have led to a different end, the safer answer is not hidden in a conspiracy, but in a simpler change. A friend does not leave. A hospital gets a name early. A call goes out. Someone stays until the paperwork includes contact numbers and medical history. Those are the kinds of details that buy time when there is any time to buy. They are also the first things to disappear when people around a dying person are frightened of the police or interested in taking property. The record suggests both forces were in play. The other reason this story keeps returning is the weight of the music attached to his name. People do not separate the song they dance to from the way the singer died. In 1989, when the Temptations stood on a Rock Hall stage, it was not a ceremony for a tragedy. It was recognition of a body of work that predated and outran the final years of one member's life. Even now, when the induction is referenced by the museum, Ruffin's image sits with the rest of the group as part of an institution's way of saying that the work is what lasts. That is where the public record draws its line for legacy. The miniseries and the lawsuit belong to the memory problem that follows any public death. A dramatization chooses scenes that play on television, and families feel the distance between those scenes and what they saw. In the court decisions, judges noted that the law protecting speech and the standards for claims like defamation or right of publicity are not easy to meet. The opinions read formally. They do not resolve a feeling. They do explain why a show can keep running even when relatives object. That outcome kept one version of David Ruffin's end on the air long enough to become another source of confusion. None of that changes what happened in the very short window that matters most. The Philadelphia police spoke to the driver. They spoke to people tied to the address. They spoke to the hospital. The coroner performed an examination and named the cause. Reporters covered those steps. The first week's stories look like a chorus. The terms do not shift. If there had been evidence to support a homicide, the file would have taken a different path. It did not. The idea that an investigation missed a killer is not supported by the material people can point to now. It is also worth saying that not supported is not a hedge. It is the standard used when a claim lacks proof. In this case, the claim that someone killed David Ruffin in a way that could be charged in court did not have the documentation behind it. The claim that someone took advantage of him after he collapsed is supported by the gap between what people said he carried and what the hospital logged. Those are not the same arguments, and they do not lead to the same kinds of cases. The first would be a felony homicide investigation. The second is an unanswered loss that points to exploitation. There is one more piece that many people remember because it ran in newspapers and on television at the time. Michael Jackson paid the funeral bill. The amount was a little over $7,000. The gesture was quiet, at least as quiet as a gesture can be in that world. It has been confirmed repeatedly in coverage from that week and in later reporting. It often appears near the end of articles for a reason. It functions as a closing detail that tells you how artists viewed him, even as the public focused on the worst day of his life. The way to close this story is the way the official record closes it. On June 1st, 1991, David Ruffin died from an accidental cocaine overdose in Philadelphia. He was dropped off at a hospital by a friend and pronounced dead an hour later. Police questioned the driver and did not file charges. The medical examiner did not change the cause. A large sum of cash that friends said he was carrying did not appear in the hospital log and was never recovered. Those sentences form the answer. They are not a twist. They do not make anyone feel better. They do explain why the case did not open the way some people wish it had. When people say they want the mystery solved, they usually mean they want something more than this. They want a culprit with a motive that matches the weight of the loss. They want a secret that redeems the person who died or shames the system that failed him. The true end is smaller. It is a man with a history of drug use going to a house where drugs were present, collapsing, and reaching a hospital without the money he may have been carrying. The driver left. The hospital did its work. The coroner wrote what the chemistry showed. The police closed their part. That is the solve. It is accurate and it is not good. What remains is the legacy that sat there before any of this happened. The songs do not carry the details of a hospital chart. The induction statue does not list the items in a wallet. If you are going to place a meaning next to his name, the catalog does that work better than any of the last night reporting. The files in Philadelphia answer the question that keeps appearing in headlines. The music answers a different question that people keep asking in living rooms and cars. One does not erase the other. They sit side by side. This is where the story ends, and it ends the way it began, with a few settled facts and a set of choices that cannot be undone. He was a lead voice in a group now frozen into a Hall of Fame snapshot. He lived his last years in a city that saw all sides of him. On a single night, he followed a set path into a set room and did not come back. The rest is commentary and rumor built on a number that was never written down. The parts that can be proved have been proved for more than 3 decades. The parts that cannot be proved are not likely to change. The answer is on paper, and it is the one the city wrote the first week. Accidental overdose, no homicide, missing money that adds pain and anger without changing the cause. That is the truth. It is the end people get, even if it will never be the end they want.